Have you ever wondered what your life would be like if it held everything you could imagine? If every moment was filled with awesome power? If all your relationships were sound and your heart was truly filled with gratitude for everything you had? If you had the power to turn every moment into an extraordinary experience? Well, believe it or not, it's all within your reach. And Richard Carlson will show you how to get there. In this program, Richard will teach you to look at the world with different eyes. Eyes of gratitude, eyes of wisdom, eyes of happiness and love. And he will teach you the power of living in the present moment. Do you sometimes feel like you're rushing through life, that there's just no point to any of it? Then slow down and let Richard show you that there is a way out without having to sacrifice your lifestyle or productivity. It's just a different attitude you need to take. Richard will show you how to eliminate fear and worry from your life and everything that is holding you back from achieving the true state of health and happiness that you desire and deserve. Now get ready to experience the love, the power, the magic of Richard Carlson as he takes you on the most incredible journey you will ever undertake. The journey to learn the true meaning of life, the true meaning of your soul. Your life will become limitless. You will look at life as you never have before. Peace, serenity, love, hope, and happiness will abound in every area of your life. And now, to begin our exciting journey of change, here's Dr. Richard Carlson.
Hi, I'm Richard Carlson, and most of you probably know me for my book, Don't Sweat the Small Stuff. But in fact, happiness and teaching people to relax has been at the forefront of my career for as long as I can remember. It's a very special topic to me. To me, life is a tremendous gift, and this is precisely the message I've been trying to share with people my entire career. As long as I can remember, I've been a happy person. Used to be a little more hyper than I am now, but I was always the peacemaker in my family, always intrigued by the subject of happiness and what makes certain people happy and what makes people tick and fall apart. When I was a child, I had a dog named Happy, so my whole life has been filled up with this intrigue with happiness. But I have to tell you, since writing the book Don't Sweat the Small Stuff, and with all the good fortune that has come my way since that, my life has become a bit of an open book. And in the self-help field, probably the greatest challenge that we face, all of us authors in this field, is that it's very important to make a concerted effort to what might be called walk your own talk or practice what you preach. Because if you don't, you really hear about it from people, particularly your friends and family, and in my case, particularly from my two daughters. And I thought I might just begin this series by sharing with you a recent story with one of my two children, just to kind of put us in the spirit of lightheartedness and to let you all know that the principles that we'll be talking about, these are things that I'm working on in my own life, things that are very special to me, but it's a process, it's not a destination. Recently, there was an article that came out about Don't Sweat the Small Stuff, which they called the phenomena of Don't Sweat the Small Stuff. And my oldest daughter, who's 9 years old, hadn't seen the article yet, but she came home from school one day with this very embarrassed look on her face, and she said to me, "Dad, we have to talk. The kids have been talking at school." And at that moment, I looked at her and I thought, uh-oh, this is one of those pivotal moments in parenting, one of those moments that I'm really going to have to step up and rise to the occasion with her. So I asked her, I said, well, what did they say, Jazzy? And she said to me, "Is it true, Dad? Is it really true?" And I said, "Well, what's that?" She said, "Is it true that you're helping to teach people to relax? You?" And I said, "Well, I'm doing the best I can, Jazzy. Yeah, I'm doing everything I can to sort of teach people to not be so uptight and to not take life so seriously." And she said, "What's this world coming to?" And stories like that have really kept me in proper perspective with all this, and recognizing that to talk about these things is one thing and to live them is something else. And in fairness, I think I do a very good job overall in living my own message, but I want you all to know that it's not something you want to keep score with. It's something that you want to try and incorporate into your life, and you will make steady jumps and incremental improvements in your process as you go on. So I hope you'll listen to this series with an open heart, but with a light-hearted open heart, so that you'll know that it's okay to mess up and to lose it from time to time, and that's all part of the process. My story is a really interesting one because as I mentioned a little bit ago, I have always been what I would call a very happy person. I always was very optimistic. I was always looking for what's right in life and these kinds of things. Always made me very sad as a child when I saw someone who was the underdog or someone who didn't have what I have or who was distressed in some way. I always wanted to reach out and help. Yet at the same time, I was very neurotic. I was very driven. I was the youngest person in my PhD program. I was the youngest person to graduate from certain programs. I was always collecting achievements. I was always in a hurry. I was a champion tennis player when I was a kid. I would organize food drives, and I would secretly do them because I wanted to see if I could raise more food than everybody else. I was also motivated by goodwill and trying to help people, but there was always this very competitive part of me that was always rushing around, comparing myself to other people, never satisfied because I was just rushing and in a hurry. And of course, every time you achieve something in your life, most people fall into the trap of the what's next, what's next. In fact, even the Dalai Lama himself, who won the Nobel Peace Prize several years back, the first question he was asked by the media was, how are you going to top this? What's next? And so I was always obsessed with winning and collecting achievements and accomplishments. And then something very tragic happened in my life that really turned me around and helped me to slow down. My best friend growing up was a guy named Robert, and he was going to be in my wedding party. And my wife and I were planning our wedding 14 years ago now up in the Columbia Gorge area in Hood River, Oregon. And he was very excited to be in our wedding party, and I spoke to him the day before the wedding. He was getting in his car to drive up to the wedding with his real terrific girlfriend at the time. And we got a call later that night that he had been killed by a drunk driver. He and his girlfriend both tragically killed. And it did something to me that I hear happens to other people when they face tragedy, and that is to really put you in a reflective state about what's really important. And ironically, Robert was probably the only friend I had growing up who really had his act together. He knew what was important. He was a very accomplished person, but he wasn't obsessed by accomplishments. And it's always stuck with me for some reason. I still have a picture of him up in one of the rooms in our home, and I talk to him regularly and think about him a lot and all the lessons he brought me. But that experience tied in with the work that I was already doing and made me realize that there's a deeper level to all this. It's not just about being happy and putting a smile on your face, but it's really about appreciation for life and understanding how fragile life is and how quickly it can end. And then, again, going back to my friends in the hospice movement who speak to people regularly on their deathbeds who do have the privilege of looking back on a life. And in all cases, people are always looking back saying, I would have done it differently. And I don't want to look back on my life and say, I should have done it differently. I want to look back on my life and say, you know what, I appreciated every day that I was given. There's something that the Buddhists do, that many Buddhists do. They wake up in the morning and they sort of look over to their shoulder and they say, is this the day that I die? And it's something that I do sometimes. I say to myself, could this be the last day of my life? Could this be the last day of one of my children's life? And there's something about that puts you in that state of gratitude and allows you to be reflective and appreciative of the day. And when you start out your day with appreciation, your world becomes alive. It really does. Rather than taking everything for granted, you're looking for what's right and you're looking for the gifts. And when you look for something, most of us as adults are very good at what we practice. And if you're practicing kindness and generosity and looking for what's right, guess what? You start to find it everywhere, not just in spectacular events, as we mentioned earlier, but in everyday, ordinary things. And so that was sort of how I got started, and it's just fed on itself. I appreciate my life, I think, more today than I did yesterday and more than the day before, and I'm hoping that will continue. And the friends that I have and my wife, who's probably better at all this than I am in terms of appreciation, is helpful to me as well. In fact, we're writing a book together next year called Don't Sweat the Small Stuff in Love. And after 13 years of marriage and being together 17 years, we finally feel qualified to do that. But together we practice appreciation, and I think it pays enormous dividends in the terms of the quality of our life. I think there is this overwhelming, insidious tendency that people have in life to treat life as if it were an emergency. And what I've discovered is that although it sometimes certainly looks that way, it really isn't. Life isn't an emergency. It's an adventure. It's a magical adventure that is full of richness and can be quite nourishing and special. And the key to that is to slow down and to start to see the beauty and to start to see all the miracles around us. And I think what I'd like people to get out of this is to start to have more appreciation in their life, to really start to appreciate the gifts in ordinary life. I mean, there's so much beauty, and life is so short, yet so many of us are rushing through to the next thing, and we're always preoccupied with how busy we are and telling everybody how busy we are and thinking about how busy we are, and always thinking that someday is going to be better than it is right now. There is a tendency, I think, in most people to think of miracles as, winning the lottery or being able to afford that new car or getting that job promotion or getting their lucky break or something like that. Certainly these things are great, I mean, everybody likes to advance in their career, and you should certainly be proud of yourself when you do and strive for excellence in everything that you do. I'm a big advocate of that. But most of life isn't about winning lotteries and contests and collecting achievements and things like that. Most of life is in the everyday, ordinary stuff. It's waking up in the morning and looking at the sunshine, and it's spending time with your children or your spouse or good friends. It's driving to work. It's appreciating the people you work with. It's appreciating your family and your friends, appreciating nature. People come home from work and they talk to their spouse typically about how hard their day was. And of course it is hard sometimes. But when you listen to the average conversation, you'd guess, if you sat back, that nothing ever goes right in the life of the average person. If you listened to the conversation and took it to heart, you'd say, boy, this poor fellow or this poor gal, nothing ever goes right. They're talking about how hard their day was and how awful it was and how terrible traffic was. But I always ask people, well, did you have lunch with somebody today? Did you have any good news? Did you make a contribution? Did you spend time with a friend? If you did, where did you go? Did you notice any nature on the way to work? Did you remember that you're lucky enough to drive a car to work? There's all these things that we take for granted that really are miracles. It's amazing when people look back on their life. You never hear them saying, I have friends in the hospice movement, and they jokingly tell me all the time, they'll say, still waiting for that one person who's on their deathbed to look back on their life and to say things like, I really wish that I had taken my life for granted more, and I wish I'd spent less time with my children and not noticed as many sunrises and smiles of children and the laughter in the background. Instead, people are always saying things like, I wish I would have put more attention on what was right in my life and the miracle of it all, and just to wake up every morning and have a life. I know I love telling this story with my little daughter, Kenna, who's 6 years old. A couple of years ago, she woke up one morning, and I guess she had been in a very deep sleep, and she woke up and she came running up to me and she said, Daddy, I can't believe it. I get another one of these. And what she was referring to, of course, was another day. She was blessed with another day of life. And it's just amazing to me what happens to the human spirit, the transformation that takes place when we put more emphasis and more attention on the very gift of life itself and the different aspects of life. And we can start appreciating things like our career and our relationships and our health and the gift of life and the gift of making a contribution to people. It's everywhere you look, and I think as we go through this journey in this series together, my hope is that people will start to notice these things. And interestingly enough, when you start putting more attention on what's right in your life, that's what starts to feed you. That's what starts to show up in your life. So you end up getting more of it. You start noticing, wow, I had a very interesting conversation with someone today, or I made a very unique contribution to my career today or to the company I work for. And all of a sudden you'll notice, you know what, there were other things last week that I took for granted. And you start building on those things, and pretty soon it becomes the norm. I mean, I notice every day in my life hundreds of things that I used to take for granted. And now I'm just very appreciative of them. Everything from a simple conversation to reading the bestseller list. It's on all ends of the spectrum. It's not just achievements, but it's everything that happens in between. At one point in my career, and I might still do it at some point, I was thinking of writing a book called If Only Then, the fallacy of the American dream. There's this notion that someday when things change, when my life improves, then I'll slow down, then I'll appreciate it, then I'll enjoy it. And you know what? All we're doing is postponing the inevitable. At some point, we have to really realize that life is right now. There's an old saying, life is what's happening while we're busy making other plans. And that's been used so much, but it's really true that there's this tendency to postpone life, to think that it's going to get better down the road. But every day we're practicing our life within the privacy of our own heads, and so if you're rehearsing unhappiness, then someday down the road, that's what you will have practiced. And so you need to start practicing now to make your life rich and enjoyable and to appreciate it now, so that someday, whenever that arrives, you'll be well rehearsed in the art of present moment living, of happy living, and you'll know how to live the rest of your life when it comes. Most of us, we look around and everybody else is scrambling and everyone's thinking that more is better, and you see people frantically rushing around and trying to do 3 or 4 things at once and always in a hurry, and everybody's always bragging about it. I call it corporate bragging. People are always talking about how busy they are. One of my favorite stories, in fact, I was flying back to Chicago from San Francisco not too long ago. In fact, I put this in my new book, this story, and these 2 gentlemen were sitting up in business class in very comfortable seats, and they were talking to each other, and they had their feet up, and they were enjoying a glass of wine, and they appeared to be friends, and the conversation went something like this. The first guy said to his friend, "Boy, this is going to be a tough week. I think I'm only going to get about 3 or 4 hours of sleep tonight, and I've got 6 or 7 meetings I've got to attend this week, and I've got to train that new employee, and it's going to be so tough, and I'll never get it all done. And, of course, then I've got to fax these reports back to the head office by Thursday." And the other guy, who was his friend, jumped into the story, and he said, "Oh, yeah? Listen to this. I've got 9 meetings in the next 4 days, and I'm only going to get 5 hours of sleep combined over the next 2 days." And they went on and on for something like a half an hour. Unbeknownst to them, I had my laptop computer, and I was taking notes, of course, on their conversation, wanting to put it into my next book. And you hear conversations like this all the time. These 2 fellows were tired on Wednesday, but it was only Monday when we were traveling. They were talking about how busy they were bragging about it, they were comparing stories, but yet here they were in the comfort of a big giant jet, sitting in a big comfortable chair with a friend. And yet all their thought, all their attention, all their conversation was on how busy they were, and we're all to some degree or another like that. We're just milking this busyness thing for all it's worth. You'd think with technology and the daytimer systems and all the incredible time-saving gadgets that we have today, you'd think that we'd have all this extra time, but all we do is fill it up. I think when people listen to this material, what's going to happen to them is that they are going to become more reflective. They're going to take a look at all the rushing around. You might be listening in the car, for example, and you look at all the people around you who are tightening the wheel and trying to get where they're going, and they're on the cell phone, and some of them are reading the newspaper and shaving all at the same time. And I think you look around and start to see the craziness of it all. My hope is that people will gain a heightened sense of appreciation for the miracle of life and the different aspects of life that we'll be talking about. My hope is that people will gain a sense of gratitude and an opening of the eyes, as it were, to take a very close look around and to stop postponing those things that are truly relevant. Most people say things like, my family is the most important thing to me. But the truth is, we speak with our actions. We vote with our actions, I like to say. You can say, my family is the most important thing to me, but then never spend any time with them. Or you can say, I really love my friends, but never jot them a note of appreciation or never call them. Or you can say, I really value my parents, but never call them to tell them how much you love them. I think what happens when people listen to material like this is that they reevaluate their lives and they start to reprioritize what's truly important. And in the process, they not only gain more appreciation, but their life becomes much more effective as well, because the things that we're going to be talking about in this series are all components of life that heighten your effectiveness, and they heighten your ability to stay focused on what's truly important and to live in the present moment and to keep your concentration on what you're doing rather than having your mind scattered in all different directions. So there's tons of benefits. It's not just personal, but it's also professional. Something that I also feel is really important to bring up in all of this is that there is this myth out there in the world and a perception that many people have that if you learn to take life in stride, and if you learn to take life a little bit less seriously, and take yourself less seriously, and take your own negative thinking less seriously, that somehow you're going to become a less effective person, that somehow you become apathetic and you don't care. And my experience has been just the opposite. The material that we're talking about here is very simple, and it's very important, but it's not simplistic. We're talking about becoming more childlike, but it's not becoming more childish. my sense is that when you can remove what I'll call the distractions of life, all the negativity and all the self-pity and all the taking life for granted, that you actually become a more effective person, that life becomes more important to you, not less important to you. What becomes less important to you are the distractions, are the criticisms that come your way, are the judgments that you've previously had in your life. All of these things tend to fade away, and what's left is what's really important. You're able to differentiate between that which is trivial and that which is very important to you. You're able to focus sometimes fiercely on what your goals are and what you want out of life. I know, for example, I am very involved in many causes. I'm a big advocate for children. I love helping certain organizations. I work very, very hard in my life. I mean, sometimes it's embarrassing. I'll put in a 16-hour day, and it seemed like a 3-hour day because I was so focused. I'm willing to work as hard as the next person, and sometimes it's important that I do. And yet at the same time, it's not overwhelming me. It's not making me feel like all I do is work or making me feel sorry for myself. So what I'm saying is that don't make the mistake of thinking that just because you're becoming more relaxed, that you're not going to be a super achiever. In fact, you can become a more accomplished person by learning to take life in stride. As we continue on our journey together during this series, some of the things that I'm going to be sharing with you are ways of creating miracles in your relationships to make your relationships more nourishing and loving. We'll be talking about issues of peace and serenity, how to have more inner peace in your life, how to feel serene, how to keep your sense of harmony when everyone around you seems to be lost in the chaos. We'll be talking about issues in the family, about how to bring out the best in your family members, how to keep your relationships loving, and how to bring out the best in yourself. We'll also be talking about the subject of happiness itself, about how to create more happiness in your life, and as well as talking about creating miracles in your career, how to make good decisions, how to bring out the best in yourself, how to know when you're in the right career, how to really access your wisdom in issues revolving around your job and career. We'll be talking about issues pertaining to physical health and some of the tips that can keep us healthy and feeling good in our life. We'll be talking about issues of financial freedom, about eliminating worry, and about how to put the odds in your favor, how to bring out the best in yourself. We'll be talking about your spirituality and how to access a spiritual sense and how to nourish your soul, how to bring out the best in your spiritual self. We'll be talking about the important topic of parenting. You know, for those of us who are parents, know the unique challenges in parenting and how important it is to bring out the best in our skills and how to maintain a feeling of love and respect while at the same time teaching responsibility and setting appropriate boundaries. Something else important we'll be talking about is how to create miracles within yourself, how to have attitude adjustments, and how to look at life differently, to frame your circumstances in a brand new way, about how to bring forth greater appreciation and to look around you and see the beauty and grace in all of life. So these are some of the things we'll be talking about, amongst others, as we go on in our journey together. So let's begin our journey now by talking about creating miracles in our everyday life. And a subject that's always been so important to me is the subject of creating miracles in our relationships. I mean, I think this has always been not only intriguing to me, but I've been very blessed with many great relationships in my life. I would probably agree with the statement that the key to everything in life is our relationships, not only with other people, of course, but with ourselves as well. The root of all happy, healthy relationships, I believe, is the same for everyone. And the root is to begin to see the innocence in people, to see the humanity in people. I think there's this incredible error in judgment that so many of us make is in terms of seeing other people as guilty. You know, you're waiting in line at the grocery store and the person doesn't appear to be moving as quickly as you would like them to. In fact, this just happened last night, actually. I was at the grocery store with my kids. And the person, from my standpoint, was doing a very good job, but all the people in line were very impatient. And I think it was one of these express lanes where they only had, you're only supposed to have like 9 items or something like that. And someone had 12 items, and the people were infuriated that the checker would allow them to go through the line anyways. And people were seeing this person right off the start as guilty. So by the time they got up to the line to have their turn to check out their groceries, they were already angry. They were mumbling things under their breath. They were disrespectful, uncourteous, unfriendly. And it was a real shame. I mean, I happen to know this checker at the store. It's where I shop all the time. And she's a delight. She's doing the very best she can. And that's true so much of the time. You know, we look at people who are inconveniencing us, or we look at our spouse and they say something wrong, and we forget that we're all the same, you know. We all get caught up in our thinking from time to time. We all have low moods, and we say and do things that we wouldn't in a higher mood. We all take ourselves too seriously. We all lose our sense of presence in life. And this is just a human condition that we're all in. We're all the same. We're all wired up the same. We all make the same mistakes. And it seems to me that when you see people as guilty instead of innocent, you're guaranteeing a bad interaction. When you see people as innocent, as inherently innocent, as doing the very best that they can, it's almost impossible to have a bad interaction. You know, when someone snaps at you, you see the innocence. You see that they wouldn't be snapping at you if they weren't feeling that way. When you're working with someone and they make a mistake, if you see them as innocent, you realize that they're not doing it on purpose. They're really doing the best that they can. I know as an author, I work a lot with publicity departments, for example. And I'll speak to other authors, even within the same publishing house, who are just enraged at the type of people that they're working with and what's not happening and what's not getting done. And of course, when you're enraged at people and you see them as guilty and you see them as faulty and you see them as insufficient or deficient in some way, that creates a defensive environment, and the person that you're working with doesn't want to see you succeed. But when you see them as doing the very best they can, and you try and embrace that and you try and bring that out in them, everything works out better. So whether it's your spouse or your child or yourself or someone you're working with or a neighbor down the street, you know, the idea is to really see people as innocent, as doing the very best that they can. And when you do, you're setting a very good foundation for not only that interaction, but all future interactions with that person. Of course, the dynamics of your varying relationships are going to be quite different. At least on the surface, it would appear that way. In other words, your relationship with your child is certainly different than your relationship with your spouse, which is different from your relationship to your acquaintances versus your close friends. Yet, there's an awful lot of focus in life on the differences. I think actually it's more important to focus on the similarities, that when you're with your child, the single most important gift you can give your child is to be present, is to give them your full and undivided attention. Same thing happens to be true when you're talking to your spouse or a boyfriend or a girlfriend or someone you work with. The sense of appreciation is also there. If you can really appreciate, the person knows that you appreciate them, it's amazing how that brings out the best in the person you're talking to. At work, it's the same way. We have all these different relationships, and the dynamics and the way we treat people are certainly different, but yet there is this commonality, this need for appreciation and presence that exists in all relationships. Understanding moods in relationships is perhaps the single most important concept to really embody and understand. I used to have a very small stress management center that people would come and see me. And I miss it. I don't do that anymore individually with people, but people would come in, and you know, people are like Jekyll and Hyde. We all have high moods and we have low moods, and our moods are sort of like internal weather. We see life very differently depending on the mood that we're in. Some of the characteristics of high moods, just very briefly, are you tend to be very non-defensive and charismatic and easygoing. When someone criticizes you and you're in a high mood, you're able to take it in stride, learn from the criticism. When somebody asks you about your past, you tend to be able to say, you know, it wasn't perfect, but, you know, my parents did the best they could. And when someone asks you about your future and you're in a high mood, you tend to see hope. You tend to see that you're making a contribution and moving in the right direction. Now, the same person in a low mood is very different. Think about yourself now, right now. It's in a very low mood. You tend to be very defensive and critical, and someone asks you about your spouse, and you say, oh, I must have married the wrong person. Someone asks you about your kids, and you say, boy, they're just more trouble than they're worth. Now, you don't really feel that way. It's just that you're in a really low mood. And I would say one of the single most important sentences to understand as a human being is this, that your mood is the source of your experience, not the effect. In other words, when you're in a low mood, that's the world you see. So the trick is to understand that when your spouse or your children or someone you work with is in a low mood, they are going to say and do things that they would never say in a high mood. So when I used to see clients, they'd come to me and I'd say, well, it sounds like you guys are just discussing this when you're both in a really lousy mood. And they would say to me, well, Rich, if we were to wait until our mood was higher to discuss this issue, it wouldn't look like a problem. And I would say to them, I know, that's the whole point, you see, but we're all like that. If you have been married to someone, or you're in a relationship with someone, or you work with someone, you know when they're in a low mood. And the trick is to not take it so seriously, to understand and to make allowances for the fact that people are low. You know when your spouse is low, for example. I know when my spouse is low. She's going to be grouchy, and she's not going to be as friendly and complimentary, and she's not going to smile at me as much. But I've learned over the years that when she's like that, it's okay. It will pass. What most people do is make the mistake of taking that mood really seriously. And it's been my understanding, and remember, I'm not a marriage counselor, but my understanding as a human being is that the number one problem in relationships is that people take each other's low moods too seriously. You got to keep in mind that if you were to leave your spouse or leave the relationship you're in and go find somebody else, you are never going to find a single person in this world that you like when they're low. In other words, once they fall into a low mood, they're going to be doing the same thing to you that your current spouse does. I used to see people, and in one day they'd be in a really high mood, and they'd say something like, you know, I love my wife. We're going to go up to Seattle this weekend and have a second honeymoon, and everything's great, and I love her so much. And then the person, I'd see them the next week, and they'd say, you know, I feel like getting a divorce. You know, this person, I can't believe I've been tricked all these years. I need a divorce lawyer. You know, do you got any recommendations for me? And I'd say, well, what about last week? And they'd say, well, I was wrong. I've been tricked. The problem is people don't understand they have moods. Instead, they think that their life has suddenly gotten worse in the last hour or two or three or the last day or week. Your life doesn't change. Only your mood changes. And when your mood changes, the trick is to say, aha, here I am in a low mood. Of course I'm going to be low. Of course I'm going to see things negatively. Of course I'm going to be pessimistic. I'm not going to make any major life decisions right now unless I absolutely have to. Life will look better an hour from now if I just leave it alone. And you know, we've all been on this roller coaster, this mood roller coaster, our whole life. We go up and we go down. And if you want to go back up, all you have to do is say to yourself, okay, I'm in a low mood. Not going to make any important decisions right now, not going to take it real seriously, and you know what? In a very short period of time, you go back up again, and everything will look different. The worst thing you can do when you're in a low mood is analyze why you're there, because thought is fuel for your mood. So if you're in a low mood and you want to extend it, you ought to think about it a lot. Now, in a higher mood, the same life looks very different. So you can see the incredible application of this in relationships, in all relationships. When your kid says to you, like my kids do once in a while, oh, I hate you, Daddy. I go, I know. Now, if you took everything a kid says in a low mood seriously, you'd be institutionalized within a week. Because kids get in low moods all the time, but so do adults, and so do bosses, and employees, and people who are driving next to you, and store clerks, and your spouse, and yourself. When you start to recognize moods and the powerful influence they have over your perceptions, it becomes a real different game. I mean, now when I'm in a low mood, I just say, oh, here I am again. So what? I've been here thousands of times. You know, the happiest person in the world, I don't know who that would be, but I can guarantee you 100% that they have their fair share of moods. The difference between that person and most other people is they wouldn't take it seriously. They'd say, it's just a mood, so what? And that's one of the keys to just outstanding relationships and to take your relationship to the next level. Give your spouse or your boss or someone you live with or work with the space to have low moods. Don't take it personally, don't take it seriously, and you will find a transformation taking place that you won't believe. We'll continue our discussion of healthy relationships in our next session. Let's discuss for a moment the subject of presence. Probably the very first thing that comes to mind for me is that when you develop a sense of presence with other people, it really enhances your rapport with that person. You know, you get a real connection with people. This is also very easy to discuss in its absence. You know, for those of us who have children can relate to this by watching the dynamic. When you are very present with a child, that child gets what he or she needs very quickly from you, and they'll just go on and they'll do something else. When you're not present with a child, when you don't have that connection, they'll frequently tug on your pants legs, and they'll need more from you, and they won't get what they need, so they'll ask more, they'll become more demanding, so you don't get that connection. So the child feels something's missing, and so they keep hounding you, asking for more. And that's when parents say, gosh, my child's very clingy, I never get any space, and all these kinds of things that happen to all of us as parents. But the more presence you have with a child, the easier it gets. Now, it's the same dynamic with a partner or with someone you work with. When you have a sense of presence, that person feels listened to. They feel a sense of connection. You become a better listener, so your learning curve increases sharply. Everything in your life revolves around the presence or lack of it. So if you're with people and you have a strong sense of presence, you develop a very strong sense of rapport. Something else that happens when you have strong presence, or what you might call an effective presence, is that you're able to really see right to the heart of the matter. When someone's talking to you, you really hear what they're saying. Also, when you're working, by the way, and you have a strong presence, you're very focused. You can see right to the heart of the matter, right to what you're working on. So you don't waste a lot of time. You don't waste a lot of energy. You don't tend to duplicate efforts. You don't repeat mistakes very often. You're really able to see what it is someone's getting at when they're speaking to you, because you're listening with nothing on your mind. You're listening with a clear and open channel. You're really able to connect with what they're saying. And finally, when you develop a strong presence, it not only makes it virtually impossible to feel stress, but it's also very de-stressing. So you also have a very releasing sense of stress. When you're very present with someone, it's as if time stands still. You know, you're really able to be right there with someone, and your mind isn't on all your worries and concerns and all these things that are wrong in your life, but rather you're right there in that moment with that person. And becoming more present is really simply a matter of noticing when you're not. When it becomes an issue for you of what I'll call quiet resolve, when you have a quiet resolve that your desire is to develop more presence, and everybody knows what that feels like. It's like when you're right there with someone and you're really engaged in a conversation and you're totally oblivious to what's going on around you other than that one conversation. When that's your desire and that's what you want, you simply have to start noticing when it's not present, and you'll start to feel this incredible dichotomy between being present and not being present. So you notice yourself not being present. You notice yourself not letting other people finish their sentences. You notice yourself not really listening, not quite being there with someone, and it doesn't feel right. It doesn't feel nourishing. And you'll start to feel this dichotomy. Sometimes you'll be there, sometimes you won't. And over time, what happens is you start to really develop a distaste for not being present. You really want that in your life. And over time, it gets easier and easier, and you just simply will not allow yourself to not be right there with someone when you're talking to them. When you first meet someone, you can remember probably the incredible feelings that you have for one another, about how special it is to be there. Everything else is sort of set aside. You know, you just love the feeling that you have when you're with someone. If the person is a few minutes late, it doesn't affect the feeling. You're just looking forward to them. You're really focused on this connection that you have. You know, those people who have had the privilege of having children know that when their first child is born, and all subsequent children as well, obviously, when the child is first born, the feeling that you have, this incredible, powerful feeling, is so special. And what I've found is that when you are looking for that feeling, it seems like a contradiction in terms, but I think you'll be able to recognize this in your own patterns of communication and being with people, is that when you look for a good feeling, you can actually find it. When my wife and I are struggling, which I'm happy to say doesn't happen a great deal of the time, but when we are, one of us will invariably try and look for that feeling again. We'll say, how can we bring that feeling back, that loving feeling that we so often have together? What is that like? And you're just sort of pointing yourself in that direction, and it spontaneously appears in your life. So nurturing the feelings are more important than anything, because when you're in that feeling, it will come as no surprise to you that that's when you have your best conversations, that's when you have your most effective communication, that's when you make your best decisions, that's when you see the innocence in people. That's when you work the best as a team. That's when you see eye to eye. And when you don't see eye to eye, that's okay. It all comes from the feeling. You know, when you say to your child, I love you. Don't you know I love you? And you're saying it and you're an angry, hostile feeling, that doesn't come across as I love you. But when you say, I love you, and it comes from a loving feeling, that's when they feel it. So it's part of the solution is just to begin to recognize the feeling that you're in. And when you're feeling out of sorts or unloving or judgmental or critical or hyper, you can sort of check in with yourself and just notice that feeling. And what will happen is you'll drift back to your innate health, to your sense of equilibrium, to a more harmonious state. And that's the feeling you're looking for. And when you're in that feeling, wonderful things happen in your relationships. As many people are aware, everybody has what's called a thought system. Everybody is brought into this world with different circumstances, different parents, different upbringings. We're led to believe that certain things are important. We give significance to one thing and not to something else. Something that's tremendously important to you may seem very trivial to me, or vice versa. There's really no right or wrong in these things. It's just the way that we're taught. And yet there's a way that we expect others are going to be just like us. They're going to see things just like us. And when they don't, it drives us crazy. We say, you really ought to look at that differently, or I can't believe he sees things that way, or I can't believe she looks at things that way. What's wrong with them? How come they can't see it the right way? And we get so lost in the disagreement that we forget that it's absolutely predictable that it's going to be that way. I've gotten to the point in my life where I'm amazed when someone sees something my way. It's a delight because I don't expect that it's going to happen very often. But most people do expect that it's going to happen all the time, and when it doesn't, it drives them crazy. It's a great source of stress. I think a great way to look at this is to imagine if you've ever been to a foreign country, and if you haven't been to a foreign country, to think of the times you've seen it maybe on television or in the movies. When we travel to a different country, we are absolutely delighted. In fact, one of the greatest things about traveling is seeing how different people are. You know, my wife and I were in Italy this last summer, and it was just amazing to us. It was delightful how different the customs were and the traditions, and how different the people were, and how they thought about things differently, and they prioritized things differently, and how they closed down their stores for a couple of hours in the afternoon and went home to be with their families, and all these wonderful traditions. We weren't offended by them. We were delighted by them. And yet we can bring that same understanding to our relationships with other people. Rather than being annoyed by people, we can say to ourselves, oh, that's interesting. I see. That's how you see it in your world. It's almost like becoming an anthropologist of sorts. It's not really what an anthropologist does, but for our purposes here, it works well. You know, you can say, oh, I see. You see it that way. And becoming very interested in the way people see things rather than becoming defensive by it. I know that 10, 15 years ago, I would have gotten very defensive when people disagree with me, or when they poked fun at me, or when they thought something that was so different than the way I think about things. Now it's sort of a source of entertainment to me. I mean, I really get a kick out of it. And again, not to overdo the point, but I've really gotten to the point where it does surprise me. I'll say, wow, you mean you really agree with me on that? That's neat. But I think if people can just lightheartedly take this point into consideration, that it's absolutely predictable and important that people see things differently and they look at life differently, it takes an awful lot of the stress out of your life. You know, I'm often asked, what is the common ground of all people? And to me, the common ground that we all share is this capacity for what I will call innate health. In other words, if you were to remove all of the insecurities in people, if you were to quiet down the chatter and remove all the trains of thought that lead towards confusion and insecurity and worry and what I'll call the woulda, shoulda, coulda syndrome that people have, if you to remove all of that from the minds of people, what you're left with is a very healthy thought process. We all have this. It's inborn in us. It's almost as if we have two distinct modes of thinking. And we're going to talk about this as we go on in future sessions as well. But we have our analytical thinking, which is extremely important, and it's very unique to us. You know, we're all taught very differently to think habitually from our own thought system. But we also have this other kind of more passive thinking that lies at the root of innate health, and that's called healthy psychological functioning. That's the difference between, when you're thinking analytically and you're busy pursuing your thinking, you're trying to come up with an answer, and it's effortful, and you're struggling to figure out your life. That's analytical thinking or computer thinking. But in the other type of thinking, this healthy psychological functioning, you empty your mind, you quiet down, and when you do so, it's as if your thoughts come to you. And we've all had that experience rather than you having to go pursue them. They come through you. And when people are in this state and they think in this healthy way, we're all the same. It's almost as though the thinking is done for us. It's a magical way to be, and it all results from our efforts to quiet down. And if you can really see that about people, that in the absence of all the craziness, what's left is this healthy thought process, and you start to speak to people at that level and really to understand that that's there. Even when people don't appear to have it, they do deep down somewhere. And when you connect with people on that level, it just brings out these incredible feelings, this connection that you have that is just almost beyond words. Relationships exist in different levels, and as you begin to see how your thinking can sneak up on you and trick you and confuse you, and how you get all caught up in your thinking, and you stop doing those things, you start to engage in what I'll call mental hygiene, positive mental hygiene. You have more reflective thinking, less confused thinking. Your level of understanding changes. Rather than being insecure and confused, you learn to settle down. You learn to quiet down, to trust that inner wisdom that we talked about just a moment ago, this innate health. The ballgame changes. Everything looks different. When you become more secure, when your level of understanding goes up, people that used to irritate you now seem like characters. So people take on a different quality. Rather than being offended when people criticize you or taking it personally, you start to see a grain of truth in what they had to say. So when someone says, you know what really bothers me about you, Richard, you talk too much, or something like that, rather than getting instantly defensive, I might say to myself, you know what, you make a good point. That exists as you get happier, as you get more secure, as you take things in stride, as you take things a little less seriously. Now, on the flip side, as your level of insecurity increases, as your level of understanding goes down, as you get more defensive and angry, those same scenarios look very different. And consequently, your relationships are experienced very differently. You approach people defensively. You're often adversarial. You take things personally. When someone criticizes you, it bothers you. It immobilizes you. Unfortunately, I think this is the state that so many people are in. They get bothered by everything. I was at a book signing about a year ago or so, and someone raised a question in the back of the room. And the question had never been asked of me before, and it kind of threw me for a moment. They said, Richard, can you describe the average American in 2 words or less? And I thought, wow, I've never thought about that before, but the words that came to me were easily bothered. People get so bothered by everything. We expect that everyone's going to be nice to us, no one's going to criticize us, everyone's supposed to love us all the time, everyone's supposed to say the right thing, always compliment us, never show up late, never have a life of their own, and they're supposed to center all their world and all their attention around me. And when they don't, I'm irritated and bothered and annoyed and stressed out, and I complain and I talk about it with other people. This is the way most people live. As your level of understanding goes up, or a simpler way of putting that, as you become happier, as you take these things less seriously, those kinds of comments don't bother you. You understand that people have a life. You're not the center of their universe. People will make mistakes. They'll show up late. They'll say things that they shouldn't have. They'll say things offensively. They'll criticize you, and you'll take it all in stride. And when that happens, boy, the nature of your life really shifts. You're not such a victim anymore. You're all of a sudden, you're in control. You're at a fork in the road. You can take it or leave it. And usually you'll decide to just dismiss it and go on with your day. It's so important, and most people find it so difficult to develop those real special relationships with the people you work with, your coworkers, your employees, your employer, all the people that you spend so much time with. The nice thing about the principles that I talk about are that they are so applicable across the board. They're universal. When we're working with people, we can sometimes forget that these are human beings too. They're not just there to serve us and work with us. They are people who get extremely caught up in their own thinking and take themselves too seriously, just like we all do, me too. They are people who get caught up in what I call analysis paralysis and being very self-critical and analyzing where they're going and where they've been and how they're not doing well enough and how nobody else is doing good enough and how no one will give you a break and all these things. They're also people who have moods. Your coworkers, believe it or not, have very high moods. They have very low moods. They get depressed. They get reactive. They take themselves too seriously. They overreact. They say things they shouldn't. But who doesn't? Sometimes I'll jokingly say to others or even to myself that, I think it's been at least 11 minutes since I said something wrong that I wish I hadn't said. It's really important to remember your humanity, to give people a break, to understand that the people you work with are just like you. Sure, the details are different, their lives are different, their lives are set up in a certain way and yours are set up in a different way. But really, when you step back from it, if you ask people, which I have done on many, many occasions, I've said to people, are you doing the best that you can? 99% of the people will tell you, yeah, I really am doing the very best I can. I wish I could be kinder to people, but sometimes I overreact. I wish I were always feeling better and could feel enthused and encouraged and never got depressed, but I can't do it. I wish I were never critical, but sometimes I get jealous, and sometimes I get critical, and sometimes I feel judgmental, and sometimes I feel sorry for myself, and sometimes I'm scared I'm not making enough money, or my future isn't bright, and I'm not going anywhere in this corporation, or I don't like my job. All these thoughts go through the minds of everybody. And if you can just start to see that and really give people a break, give them the benefit of the doubt, I think that you'll find that it's really much easier to get along with people. Someone that I work with on a very regular basis is someone that generally I like very much, and she's been going through some enormous personal problems lately and really hasn't been herself, and it quite frankly has affected some of the things that I'm doing. And I know that just this simple awareness that, wow, this person is going through some really difficult times right now, and I don't know exactly the details of what those difficulties are, but I know something's going on. She shared with me that there are things going on. And just knowing that, she's a human being and her life does not revolve around me. It's not about serving Richard Carlson's needs. It's about her whole process. Work is very important to her and she's very good at what she does. But just knowing that in my heart has really freed me to just make allowances for the fact that right now she's not at her best. And I know that very soon she'll be back and everything will be fine. Now, the opposite way of looking at that would be very typical. It would be that, wow, this person's not serving me. I should issue a warning. I should talk to her about it. I should do something harsh. I should be angry, upset, disappointed, or something like that. You see this all the time. And all that does is make the person sad, defensive, passive-aggressive. So many different ways that comes out. It serves nobody, ever. And it only serves to hurt people, including yourself and your own efforts. So I think it really behooves us to really understand that our coworkers are just like us, albeit the details are different. But if we can treat people the same way we would want them to treat us, which of course is an old cliche, but it really works here, I think you'll find that your relationships at work can be greatly enhanced. A concern that comes up for a lot of people when I talk about this is they'll say, well, that's easy for you to say, but what about when someone's criticizing you and you really have done everything you can do and they really shouldn't be criticizing you? Are you saying that we should just sort of roll over and let people criticize us, or that we shouldn't care what people say about us, or that we shouldn't care when someone is judgmental towards us, or that they're wronging us? And of course, that's not what I'm saying at all. There is a balancing act here that you have to be aware of. But what happens is when you start to trust not so much your analytical thinking, but this other type of thinking that exists when you quiet down, that's your wisdom. That's what will tell you when to take action, when to back off. The interesting thing about this healthy functioning that we've discussed briefly is that people make the mistake of thinking that when you quiet your mind down, you're not thinking. And that's not true. When you quiet your mind down, you're still thinking. You're just thinking in a different way. You're allowing thoughts and comments to come at you, but you're just not reacting to it so much. So you quiet down. It's as if it comes in one ear and it sits there quietly and then goes out the other ear. You're not analyzing the person's comment. You're not saying, that's the 7th time this week that someone's criticized me in the same way. Instead, you're just allowing the person to make their comment. you reflect on it gently, and then you let it go. Now, if there is validity in the person's comment, you'll know. You'll know exactly what action to take. You'll know what to say or what to do. Sometimes I'm criticized. I mean, one of the interesting things that happens when you are fortunate enough to become successful in whatever you do is you get tons more criticism than you did before you were successful. And so I get tons of criticism now from, people will write a bad review or something like that. And when I read a bad review, I actually like it sometimes because I learn from it. Sometimes there's a grain of truth. Rather than getting defensive, I'll read it and I'll see, is there something I can learn from this? And oftentimes, quite frankly, there is. So the striking thing about all this is that if you don't take it personally, if you're not defensive, your learning curve increases dramatically because you don't take the criticism seriously, but you do take the opportunity to learn seriously. People often ask me, why is heart-to-heart communication so important in relationships? And this is something that I've thought a great deal about and write about in most of my books. And to me, it's really everything in relationships, that to learn to really speak at the heart level and speak what I'll call heart-to-heart. Because at the root of all good communication, of course, is rapport. And when you learn to speak from your heart, you develop this rapport, this ability to really allow people to trust you and that you to trust them and to connect with people in a way that's not superficial, but you're connecting at a deeper level. It's critical that you don't just jump in and talk to people about all the various thoughts that are just flying through your mind, but rather quiet down, listen, allow the other person to become comfortable with you before you just jump in. The easiest examples of these are probably around the home, although they apply to all sources of communication. When you have a difficult conversation to engage in with your teenager, for example, the worst thing you could do is just start lecturing. You haven't developed any rapport. You don't have the rapport. Even though you're the father or the mother, you don't have the necessary rapport to jump in and start badgering your teenager. You've got to sit there for a moment. You've got to make that connection. And this is a really interesting thing to talk about because you can't quite put your finger on exactly what it is, but at the same time, everyone knows it's there. You sit with the person, you listen, you quiet down, you check out the feeling, you make sure the time is right. You ask if this is a good time to have a conversation. I know with my two kids, I'll say to my 9-year-old, for example, I'll say, is this a good time for us to have a conversation? And she'll say, yeah, or she'll say no. And if it's not, I'll just wait. But she'll say, yeah, this is a good time for us to have a conversation. And I'll say, well, there's something that's been bugging me and I wanted to talk to you about it. Would that be all right with you? And you can feel it even on tape when it's someone else talking. You can feel that there's a sense of respect that goes along with that kind of communication, of setting the stage, of giving the other person an out, giving them permission, getting their permission to have the conversation to begin with. It's like finding your bearings. It's developing the common ground so that before you even begin the nuts and bolts of the conversation, you're already one step ahead. You've already been given permission by the teenager or by the person you're talking to that it's okay to have this conversation. Heart to heart is a real loving way to communicate with people. I try to talk heart to heart with people all the time. I'm trying to talk heart to people right now as I'm speaking. To me, when you're badgering someone or you're speaking too quickly or you're jumping out of turn, you're not waiting for the appropriate time to jump in, to me that's wasted communication. It elicits a defensive response very often. It encourages people not to listen to you. But when you really connect with people and you make sure it's the right time to communicate with someone and you set the stage well, it almost guarantees that the conversation is going to go well. And there are actually specific steps that people can take to pretty much ensure effective communication. And we sort of touched on them already, but let me sort of go through them. The first is to really find your bearings. And what I mean by that is to make sure that it's a good time. Try not to talk to people when you're really angry or you're really frustrated. When I was a kid, when my dad was really mad at me, he'd start counting to 10 really quietly with his eyes closed. And I knew he was very angry at me at those times. But what I did take away from that and what I learned from that with my own children is that, there is some wisdom there that if I'm really angry and reactive, that's not the time to talk to someone. That's not the time to bring up an issue of importance. Or when you're really frightened, it's not the time to talk to your spouse. The time to talk to people is when you have your bearings, when you've gathered yourself, when you feel secure, when you feel as though you're able to make a connection. Now, I know that there are times that you've got to react and you've got to respond right now. You're at work in a conversation, you don't have your bearings, but you've got to say something to someone or contribute to a conversation. You're in the middle of a meeting, you don't have time to sit back and reflect. I know that. But even knowing that it's important can insulate you from many of the problems of communication. In other words, if you know that you've lost your bearings, you know you're in a real low mood and you're not quite right, you'll automatically make allowances for what you'll say. You'll say to yourself something like, well, I know I'm a bit defensive right now. This is not an ideal time to talk, but I have to talk. So I'll factor that awareness into this communication. And that saves you oftentimes. So finding your bearings is extremely important. Something else that's really important in communication, I believe, is letting go of your expectations of how the conversation is going to go. A lot of times we plan out in our mind. We play it out in advance. We'll say, well, I'm going to say this, and then she's going to say this, and I'm going to say this, and it's probably going to turn out this way. And what that's doing is it's frightening you. It's giving you an expectation. It's lowering your spirits. It's making you tighten up. It's encouraging you not to listen to what's really happening because you've already determined what is going to happen. A better way to communicate is to back off of your expectations and ask yourself, is it all right now to just see where this goes? So when I'm talking to my 9-year-old, I'll say, okay, let's talk about this. And I'm not going to have any expectation about what's going to happen. Consequently, I'll learn something from it most of the time. Sometimes the conversation will go one way, and sometimes it'll go a different way, and that's okay. That makes life richer. It makes your communication richer. The person you're talking to also can tell when you have expectations. They'll sense it from you, but when you let go of that, it's so much fun to talk to someone when they don't expect you to say a certain thing, when they don't expect you to look at them a certain way, but you just allow them to be free, to be a human being, to speak from their heart, and you listen with respect. So it's extremely important to let go of those expectations. We also talked briefly, and I'll just mention it again, that it's important to get permission, and I know that my wife's really good at this. We'll be out to dinner. If something's bugging her, and she'll say to me something like, Rich, you seem really happy tonight. And I'll say, yeah, things are going great. I'm really, really pleased at the way things are going. And she'll say, well, that's great, because there's something I'd like to talk to you about. She'll set it up in advance. Now, it's almost funny listening to that, but think about the wisdom there. Think about what it would be like if I was defensive and angry and not in the mindset to hear a criticism she might have or a suggestion that she might have. But now that I'm lighthearted and she sort of set it up that way, she'll say, it's bothering me the way you're doing this, or I wish you would speak differently to the children, or I wish you would stop forgetting to do this, or whatever. And now I'm not in a defensive mindset, so I'm able to hear what she has to say. It just keeps the communication light and effective, and it allows her to say what she needs to say, and for me to hear what I need to hear. But it all involves getting permission. We talked a little bit also about speaking from the heart, and just to sort of recap the importance of that, speaking from your heart is different from speaking from your head. When you speak from your head, you sort of plan it out, and you think through what you're going to say, and you rehearse in your mind. One of the things that I'm very proud of myself in my public speaking is that I don't use notes. I don't think that notes are a good thing to do, because a lot of times what speakers will do is they'll have a very detailed outline, and they'll think through exactly what they're going to say. And if you hear them the next week in a different city, they'll say the same thing. They'll tell the same jokes, and after a while, it's very canned. But people do that in their conversations as well. They plan out what they're going to say and what it's supposed to turn out like, and it's almost like a machine. Rather than being a human being, you're like a machine in action, and then you get bothered when it doesn't turn out the way you think it should turn out. That's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is speaking from your heart, letting go of your expectations, allowing yourself to be human. And occasionally you'll make mistakes when you speak from the heart, but so what? Everybody else is making mistakes as well. So give that a try as well, and I think you'll be pleasantly surprised. And finally, a really great way to prepare for effective communication is to listen with nothing on your mind. And there is some overlap with what we've talked about. But what I mean by this is that a lot of times when people are listening, they are not so much listening, but thinking about their response while the person's speaking. They're thinking about what they're going to say in response. They're waiting for their turn. They're ready to butt in. So someone's spilling their heart out to you, and rather than just listening as a clear channel with an open mind, with nothing on your mind, you're already preparing what you're going to say. Now think about that from a practical standpoint. There's no way that you can listen effectively. There's no way that you can really have great rapport with someone, or that great connection we're talking about, if you already know what you're going to say and all you're really doing is waiting for your turn. Sometimes when I go around the country and I do speaking engagements, there's a dinner the night before or something like that, and I'll go to some of these corporate parties, and it's shocking to me how I walk around the room and it doesn't appear to me that anybody's listening to anybody. They're all just waiting their turn to talk. And it's amazing to me when I talk about these issues in actual lecture, how many people recognize that that is indeed what we've all gotten into the habit of doing. And it's a pretty easy habit to break if you just become aware of it, So if you practice these steps to effective communication, I'm relatively certain they will take you a long way toward better, more loving, effective communication. Probably the most important way to get a fresh start in a relationship is to understand the way to guarantee that you can't get a fresh start in a relationship, and that is to assume that the other party, the other person you're in a relationship with, is going to do it for you. That's the mistake most people make. They say, well, he has to change, or she has to change, or it's not going to work. The best place to start is with ourselves, is to find hope. And the way you find hope is to think back to the times that you really did have a good relationship. You think back to when you first met, or you think back to the last time you had a period of time when things were going really well. You take your attention off of the current drama. I always like to think in terms of turning your melodrama into a mellow-drama, with some space between those two words, to de-emphasize the current situation and to think about what it is that you really love about that person, to recognize that there's always a spark there. There's always a way to find hope and to think about the possibilities that things could be better. The next thing that's really important, the next step, as it were, to get a fresh start, is to recognize your own thinking. I was working with this young woman once, a long time ago, and we were talking about how people have conversations in their own heads all day long, all night long, in the shower, in the car, and what they're really doing is, unbeknownst to them, they're practicing having a bad relationship. And she got sort of defensive, and she goes, well, I don't really know what you mean. And I said, well, just pay attention to what you're thinking about as you drive home today to your fiancé. And I got a call later on my voicemail, or my answering machine. In those days, I guess it was an answering machine. And she said to me, the most remarkable thing happened. I was driving home, and I was listening to the radio, and a story came on the radio about how many marriages end up in divorce. And I started thinking about my situation, how likely it was going to be that I was going to end up divorced. And I was blaming my fiancé, and I was going through all these incredible gyrations in my mind and anticipating all these problems. Pretty soon I was all worked up, and I was tightening the wheel. And all of a sudden it hit me that, my goodness, I've been driving for 30 minutes, absolutely perfecting the art of despising my fiancé. I got to the door and realized what I had been doing, and I was able to let go of it a little bit. And she told the story really beautifully, and I think it applies to almost everybody, that there's all these times that we're thinking about this and we're thinking about that, but as amazing as it seems, we forget that we're the one doing the thinking. It's us. It's me. When I'm having a conversation in my head, I'm the one who's having the conversation. It's absurd to blame my wife for any problems that we're having at that point. So recognizing your own thinking gives you the humility that's needed to back off, to have a sense of humor, to recognize your own contribution to the problem. And oftentimes that will give you an enormous sense of hope, because you start to realize that, hey, I'm playing a part in this too. Another thing that's really important is to see past your habits to the innocence in your partner and yourself. And of course, one of the things that my wife is absolutely remarkable at is seeing the innocence in other people, particularly me. I remember a couple times in our marriage I've come up to her kind of embarrassed, and I'm going to tell her something, and I'll muster up the strength to talk to her, and I'll tell her the story, and she'll look at me like, what's the punchline, Like, why should you think that you're exempt from the rest of humanity? I mean, you're just a human being. People make mistakes. They say bad things. They get themselves into messes. We're all human beings. She sees me as innocent. And she has taught me to see everybody else as innocent. And when you see your partner as innocent, you start to realize that they wouldn't have been mad at you all those times and all those years if they had a choice, if they felt they had a choice. They're not intentionally beating themselves up and getting depressed and getting mad at you. That's not something that people set out to do. They don't wake up in the morning and say, I think I'm going to really be angry at my partner today. It just happens innocently. And when you start to see the innocence in people, the profound innocence, it really opens the door for you to nurture that hope that you need to get a fresh start in your relationships. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, is to use the old adage to forgive and forget. I mean, you really have to start recognizing at some point that if someone harmed you or wronged you or did something to you in your past, that it's only alive now in your thinking, that you carry it around with you. Those thoughts are yours, and you're the one doing the thinking. And if you can recognize that and let go of those thoughts, it's relatively easy to forgive people. And of course, all of these principles tie into each other. As you forgive, you're seeing the innocence, you're finding hope, you're recognizing your own contribution. They all start to flow together, and as they do, it can give you an enormous sense of encouragement for your future. If you want to create miracles in your relationships, I think it's important to reflect on the fact that you've probably never met a person in your life, nor will you ever meet someone who doesn't love to be appreciated. People absolutely love to be appreciated. Think about yourself. When someone appreciates you, when they listen to you, when they're present with you, when they're really locked into your conversation, it's such an awful feeling, when you're talking to someone and they're looking at their watch and they're preoccupied and they're not there with you. And you can sense that immediately, of course. All of us can. But when you really focus on appreciation and appreciating the people you work with, you live with, that you love, your friends, neighbors, everybody, it's just amazing what starts to happen. People are drawn to you. They want to be around you. They want to see you succeed. They want to help you. They want to make your life easier. And you're helping them. You're bringing out the best in them. And just everybody wins. And so many wonderful things come about as a result of feeling grateful and feeling appreciative of other people. That's really the best place to start.